at any rate, this is our wrap-up session, and in thinking about it, I think it's important to think of this as not. It's a yeah, right. Well, you know, it's a good wrap-up session, but it's not a concluding session. That at least some of you will be moving on to the second phase of this, which is a reminder that this is not a self-contained meeting of. I mean, what I told my wife was, yeah, it's all the usual suspects, with the one proviso that Jamil has gotten all of the good usual suspects. But I think that I've got a couple of comments in terms of the last couple of days. I think that the experience of the last 2 days reflects the challenge, notice I'm saying challenge, not problem, but reflects the challenge that we are all facing. This has been a marvelous cafeteria of really interesting information. But it's a little piece here and a little piece here. We've got art, we've got law, we've got philosophy, we've got this, we've got this. And what we don't have is a grand narrative to tie it all together to compete with the grand narrative in the title. And so that I think that this is our experience in the last couple of days is reflective of where we all are in, and I'm going to have to say it this way, in our respective fields. I was about to say in our field, but part of the difficulty is that it isn't our field. It is our respective fields coming together, and we need to be really thinking in terms of a more integrative kind of way of talking. We shouldn't have to agree on everything. We shouldn't all have to accept that Bernard Lewis is a heretic. I mean, some of us might even believe still in him. But we do need to have a unifying kind of approach. And I want to just remind us in this session of what this gathering is. We have all justifiably thanked Jamil and Susan and everybody at GMU and all of that. It's really an important job. They've done hard work. But there's somebody else that I think we need to recognize that in some way, and I hope Pam can recognize, somebody from NEH will remind the home base that we are saying this. We've also got to recognize and remember Jim Leach. That when Jim Leach became the head of NEH, he had a very important vision, which was he wanted a major project on bridging cultures. It was the Bridging Culture Initiative. And if you read the RFP, the request for proposals, a lot of us looked at that and chickened out. Thank goodness there were brave people like Jamil. But this was a major initiative and is a major initiative. Jim does not have a huge amount of money, and he has put a very substantial amount of resources into a whole broad range of bridging culture workshops. And so I think that it's useful to remember that that's why we're here, in a sense, that we had the resources to then have people like Jamil putting together this in an imaginative way. Now, I just want to briefly then talk about bridging cultures. I think that our last 2 days have identified some interesting bridging initiatives that I wanted to sort of just focus briefly your attention on. Jim Leach's vision was bridging two grand cultures, Western culture, American culture in particular, and building bridges between that and Islamic culture and history. Basic assumption. Americans need a better understanding of Islam, and they do. And I think that this is that first bridge that's being constructed. But bridges are built out of stuff. And one of the things that I find interesting as I do discourse analysis over what I've heard in the last 2 days is that one of the difficulties that we have with this counter-narrative is that the building bricks for our bridges, that is, the terms and words that we use, are not things that we can agree upon. And we spend quite a bit of time wondering if we're really talking about empires, or what does it make a difference that the English label empire doesn't fit the Safavids, or doesn't fit whatever. And I think that in just looking at the process of building bridges, we've been working very well in the first bridge, but one of the problems is a simple, basic problem that we really have to begin to think in terms of how we say what we're saying. But there's a second bridge as well that is also structured in the RFP and is very well structured within what Jamil put together for us. And that is, this is the bridge between specialists and the general public. And this is probably the biggest and most important bridge. That here again we have a problem of language and balance. We have a problem that's been identified throughout virtually every panel, that what we know, what each of us know in our particular field, is something that tends to be widely at variance with what the general public out there thinks about Islamic science, or thinks about Sharia, or thinks about Iranian imperial ambitions, or whatever. And so I think that the second thing is then that this bridge of specialist and general public, I did have a couple of people who said that they appreciated sort of my grumpiness about well, you know, how can we ask a different question rather than just trying to disagree with Bernard Lewis and give a different answer to his question. And we're still at the stage of trying to figure out what our question is. And I think that we should, though, take a lesson from what went wrong. We are all operating within the framework correctly, that historically Americans and the West don't know much about Islam. We have this long history of misunderstanding, of incorrect understanding, of crusader mentalities and so on. But what Bernard Lewis was able to do was to focus it in 3 words. He said, what went wrong? And he wrote a book, and it was one of those books that is a very useful kind of book. There are certain books where if you know the title, you don't have to read the book. Yeah. You can pretend that you've read the book because the title itself is so evocative. The Study of Modern Nationalism. I mean, you know, I have graduate students that know what imagined communities are, and I'm sure they've never read Benedict Anderson from beginning to end. But, you know, imagined communities is bingo. It's right there. I mean, what went wrong? Imagined Communities, or Olivier Roy in the mid-90s, marvelous title. You don't have to read the book, The Failure of Political Islam. Now, the problem is, of course, if you don't read Olivier, you don't recognize that he's saying political Islam was pretty benign compared to the bourgeois and proletarian kind of fundamentalism that might replace it. And, you know, the old kind of book of the medium is the message for those of us who are old enough to remember Marshall McLuhan. But in a sense, for our cause, one of us has to both not just write a good book, but write a good book with that punch title so that we can all join in the jihadi crusade to move forward in this. Now, there is, however, a third bridge that I have seen. Probably this is the bridge that has been most successfully built because already the foundations are there and so on. And that is the interesting bridge among us. You know, that the Ottomanists don't get together with the Mughalists very often, and those heretic Safavids tend to be off in the corner much too often. And what we've got really is a structure, this community that we've had for 2 days, and some of you will have for longer, has been working within an area that I think is very crucial. And that is this, that if the specialists are going to be clear in what they say to the general public, it would be nice if the specialists would be clear to each other and would be able to be more effectively informed and create a basically integrated kind of presentation of our information to each other as well as to the broader world. Now, finally, what have I got? A couple more minutes, right?
You have 5 more minutes, John.
Wow, there you go. Okay, that was what I was hoping. He's going to keep time for me, and I let him talk as long as he wants, and then I'll. The other thing, though, is as the final thing, we've got our 3 bridges that I wanted to mention. There is, as we are talking amongst ourselves as specialists in these last 2 days, there is an ambiguity in the discussions, in the relationship between the discussions and the title. Golden Age and Decline. Now, the old Golden Age and Decline is that grand narrative that was invented by Arab nationalists that said when the Turks took over in the 13th century, everything fell apart. And that when the Arabs ceased to be central, when the Mongols captured Baghdad or something like that. And so that the one grand narrative is the Golden Age, the Umayyads and the Abbasids, the Caliphs, the Arab Age. And then the decline is the last 8 centuries, or the last 7 centuries until until everybody who was sleeping around was wakened up by imperialism or whatever. Now that is one grand narrative of Golden Age and decline that is embedded in lots. I don't know how many people, how many of these little introductions still mention the end of the great Golden Age of Islam with the capture of Baghdad in 1258. And that's a repetitive trope in dozens of things. However, here, in addition to that Golden Age decline narrative, of course, each of our empires has their Golden Age and decline narrative that they want to displace. And so the Ottomanists want to get rid of the dissing of poor Salim the Sot, who caused 3 centuries of decline after the great day of Suleiman. Or you've got Shah Abbas as the Golden Age and everything declines after that. Or you've got Akbar and everything declines after that. I think that we need to be aware in the kind of discussions that we've been having that we have 2 nefarious grand narratives of Golden Age and decline. We have 2 very different narratives that we need to be aware of and that we need in our work to be trying to see what we can do to correct those images. So at any rate, I could go, we can talk about our terminology, we can talk about our bridges, we can talk about our grand narratives, but we've got another sort of hour to talk after, or so after Richard talks.
Okay, thank you very much, John. You were within your time limit, and I hope that doesn't mean I have to be. So, I want to disagree with most of what you said, just in the spirit of having this being a concluding discussion or a wrap-up discussion. The title of this conference is Beyond Golden Age and Decline, and then there's a subtitle, which is very different. The Legacy of Muslim Societies in Global Modernity. We haven't talked about the subtitle very much. That's right. We've only talked about Golden Age and Decline. Frankly, I think that if you look into the genealogy of decline, you get to Edward Gibbon, and that the whole resonance of that word is based on the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. And Giancarlo has pointed out that when Lewis specified the decline for the Ottomans, that he was reading Ottoman texts. And if you ask where do people of, let's say, policymakers or people of consequence get their ideas about decline in the Muslim world, they didn't read Bernard Lewis. They didn't read the Braunschweig's old symposium on classicism and cultural decline. They talked to leaders in the Muslim world. They talked to political leaders who trashed their own people. When General Omar Suleiman said the Egyptians are not ready for democracy, he did not stand out. That is what people have been saying for the last 150 years in Middle Eastern polities, partly because they believe it, but more than that, because they think that's what the Americans want to hear, and that it is their way of becoming compradors, of becoming allies of the imperial overlord. So that one of the great problems has been not so much that Bernard wrote something that that impresses John more than me, but the fact that the elites in the Middle East, secular nationalist elites, government leaders, generals, and so forth and so on, have been suck-ups to the imperial overlords. And that's us, at least. I'm speaking as American here. So there's a problem there. But it's also an opportunity because those elites are now quivering with fear. They are shaking in their boots because their time has come. And now is the time to, in a way we've never had it before. We didn't even have it this way 6 months ago. Now is the time to actually try and launch alternative interpretations, because the old interlocutors are no longer standing on firm ground, and the Americans don't have the foggiest idea of what to think. You know, from Obama and Hillary Clinton down to the man in the street, nobody has a clue as to what's going on. What a great time. This is an opportunity. And the Israelis don't know what's going on either. I mean, this is a moment we've never seen before. And so this is a time not simply to have an exchange among scholars, but to try to formulate alternative approaches. Now, you know, there may be some people who are enthusiastic about Bernard Lewis in this room. Personally, I don't think we've beat him up enough, so I'm going to do a little more.
Super.
What Bernard did, his worst book, I know there's a competition on this, but his worst book was not What Went Wrong. His worst book was The Muslim Discovery of Europe. That's the one where he starts out by saying, this is a book parallel that will talk about the Muslim discovery of Europe in parallel to the European discovery of the wide world in the era of reconnaissance, and the message is, it never happened. Because the Muslims have no curiosity, they have no inventiveness, they don't learn languages, they are simply dullards. Now that resonates much more with the current portrayals than the word declined. I mean, decline's kind of a technical thing. We can debate decline. You know, is it 5% decline, 10% decline, et cetera, et cetera. But the notion that the Muslims in the world are kind of, you know, thaqil. I mean, that they're thick. That they can't invent anything. That has been something that has gone around, and it is something that has been shaken by the crowds in the street in Tahrir Square, in Pearl Square, and so forth, because now I think the American people are saying, you know, these people actually, maybe they're admirable. Maybe they can do something important. Maybe we should revisit our notion of who and what they are and what they're capable of. Now here, I have to call to mind a couple of interventions by Ahmed Kara Mustafa saying, you know, everything you're talking about would be totally nonsensical at a meeting of the American Academy of Religions, because the discourse in the religion field is totally different from that in the history field. This is a problem, and I think that was correctly observed. So one of the things is, should we have shunned religion to the degree that we did? Now you can say we didn't shun religion. We talked about Sharia. We talked about political theory. We didn't talk about Sufi brotherhoods. And we didn't talk about conversion. Now, the legacy of Muslim societies in global modernity, 1300, 1900. 1300, 1900 is the golden age of Islam. Most, well, let's say a majority of all the Muslims in the world today are the direct descendants of people who converted to Islam after the Mongol conquest, not before. They are not having a voice in our current discussions of Islam in the world. And yet, they make up very large proportions of the human migration population that is coming into all parts of the Western world and all parts of the world altogether. So, you know, I don't want to go back to my Muslim North, Muslim South argument, but the fact of the matter is, we should be able to talk about the Muslim South, the Africans, West Africans, East Africans, South Arabia. We never talk about South Arabia. We should be able to talk about, well, say Southern India as opposed to simply the Delhi area, Bangladesh, which is south of 25 north latitude, Southeast Asia, et cetera, and some other outlying areas like China. This is where the new Muslim populations came into being. Now, why would vast numbers of people in the world convert to a religion that was in the midst of decline? It makes no sense. That is the most obvious refutation to the argument of decline that you can have, that millions and millions and millions of people voted with their faith to become Muslims at a period where we in the West are saying, oh, well, that's in decline. Now, if you go into the detail of the content of the faith, people will say, oh, well, a lot of that is Sufi mysticism and, you know, backward-looking medieval superstitions and so forth, as if Christian Europe isn't full of the same stuff, but, or Christian America even more. But the thing is, you can look at it a different way. And the slogan I would use is, Islam, the open civilization. If you look at Europe, Europe goes around the world. It brings in foodstuffs and design motifs and you know, daily practices and styles of clothing from other parts of the world. There's not a single idea that the Europeans ever pick up from anywhere else in the world and give it any mileage. They're very open to new ideas so long as they're European ideas. So we praise the Enlightenment, but we admit nobody into the category of the enlightened who's not a European. Unless they're a student of Kant or something. I mean, you know, there are a few. But if you look at Islam during this period, it is the most open civilization the world has ever seen. Islam is not only open to everybody, but it integrates. Everybody who comes into Islam feels a part of Islam, even though their particular parochial version of it may not pass the Salafi purity test. Nevertheless, I think this is terribly important. This is what makes the Ummah so different from, say, the worldwide Christian faith community. This is what makes the Hajj the most important cultural institution in the world. It is the fact that Muslims of every stripe, or checkers, or polka dots, or whatever. They're all Muslims. They're all in the Ummah. And because Islam is the open civilization. And I think that we have, in a sense, bought into the Salafi argument that there's something impure about certain types of Islam, and other types of Islam are the only ones that are acceptable. Well, let the Salafis try and sell their doctrine. They're successful in some areas, they're not successful in other areas. But for most Muslims, their future is not a Wahhabi future. And they're proud of their traditions. I live in New York, where most of the Senegalese taxi drivers are Muridis. And you find about the Muridiya if you talk to them, where those who aren't Muridis are Bangladeshis or something. I mean, Islam is such a remarkably fruitful and diverse community. But if you look at the Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal empires, it's there, and yet there's a defensiveness about it. And I think that, in a sense, we have two different discourses. One that we have highlighted, which is, let us fight back this notion of decline, because it didn't happen, or there are other interpretations of it. But I'd rather follow a different discourse, a parallel one, in which we say that the characterization of Muslims as a faith community, as being dull, unimaginative, backward, devoid of curiosity, devoid of openness to new ideas, that is fundamentally wrong. And I think that that this is where we should be retargeting our message. If I were a South Asian Muslim living in Bradford, or a Afghan taxi driver, or a Bangladeshi working in the Gulf, or Shiite Lebanese in Nigeria, or a Puerto Rican convert to Islam in New York City, lots of Hispanic converts to Islam, I wouldn't think much of a discussion that talked about the Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal worlds. I would say that's very important for the academics. And it is. I'm glad we've had the conference. I think we've had some wonderful stuff. But if this is the moment when there is a rare opportunity to reshape a discourse, we can't do it by simply saying that the idiom of decline doesn't work. We have to be more proactive and come out with something else that is inclusive rather than restricted to the polities that we have been talking about. And I don't know, I only thought of the phrase Islam, the open civilization, 5 minutes before the session started, so I'm not invested in it. And I'd be happy to have someone who has a better one, but I happen to think that's the spirit that we should be aiming at, is to be inclusive, contemporary, and conscious of the fact that this period from 1300 to 1900 was a great period for Islam. A great period for Islam, rather than a period of decline and so forth and so on. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.
Okay, what I would suggest is that we now have time for questions, not just for Richard and me, but for anybody. Time for observations, but I would also suggest that the observations probably shouldn't be too extended. But at any rate, Giancarlo.
I would like to endorse what Professor Bulliet just said. As much as I'm attached to the Ottoman Empire, and I love studying empires. I think that in terms of the way to get away from the narrative of decline, there's no way that you can do that with empires, because empires they're all gone. So if you equate Islam with any particular empire, you've already doomed yourself because it's gone. And there's also something inherently pathetic about banging on about empires, right? It's pathetic when Italians do it and they're talking about the Roman Empire. It's pathetic when the British do it and they talk about the British Empire, and it's precisely because they're gone, right? So I really think that this project of finding a new way of framing the discussion in terms of a trajectory of success that actually is framed around things that people today really have a lot of respect for, which is the ability to do things without a state, the ability to move internationally and retain cohesiveness, the ability to enhance interactions across long distances, to enable communications, to enable transactions, to incorporate flexibility. Those are all things that are touchstones of what people have respect for in the 21st century, especially young people. And those are all things that you can use to draw a connection with the past. And this is, I've found in my own classes useful not only to engage students with the history of Islam, but actually to engage students with world history. When in my own world history class, I use Islam as a frame to sort of follow the path of internationalization of markets, internationalization of culture, internationalization of intellectual life. And there isn't any other frame that is as suited to that kind of larger narrative. So this really makes sense to me.
Patrick.
Thanks, John. I found two areas in which I thought the conference made really big advances. One was just the forceful critique of great man history. There were three really excellent articulations of it. I mean, on one hand, it's so obvious, but on the other hand, I have a stronger resolution in when I'm jamming things into tinier spaces for my world history courses, that the Ottomans, Safavids, and Mughals are not going to be presented through three monarchs. That was one essential point. Another point was made more broadly, and that's a notion of that the term early modern can be just redefined to emphasize all of the interactions that were happening in all directions. We started off with, well, I see. We got this in terms of comparative philology. We got this in terms of the time at which the Hajj began. We got it in terms of Stephen Dale's discussions of the Turco-Mongol ancestry of all three empires. We got it in terms of this wonderful discussion of vernacular languages. This is a very powerful tool and can be applied most obviously to this term, this early modern time that we've been looking at. It becomes a way of looking at history. So those are big steps forward. One thing that sort of understandably never got mentioned is the major books that are being written nowadays on empires in general that are wrapped around what we have discussed. So let me mention in particular John Darwin's After Tamerlane, which is a Eurasian imperial survey, and then Jane Burbank and Fred Cooper's Empires in World History, same sort of thing. In these cases, the empires that we're looking at are sort of the middle part of the argument. They're in there to fill something which is, more about 19th and 20th century. But this group needs to be figuring out how to connect to those. Just as a response to Richard's remark about the expansion of Islam, it's the same time, or some of the same time, where Catholicism is nearly defeated in Europe, and on the other hand expands dramatically over other parts of the world. So there's an interesting, there's a parallel as well as the contrast there. We didn't get to talk enough about the 19th and 20th centuries, and not enough about modernity. And maybe that's too much to take on. Maybe it's maybe it's what I think is wonderfully successful handling of the earlier period provides a basis.
If we can't agree on early modern, how are we going to agree
Oh,
on
no,
modern?
no. But we have, but that's the reason this is happening, is discussing that bigger issue. So I just want to conclude with one complaint about not the discourse here, but the public discourse. As soon as the events in Tunisia happened, as soon as there were echoes of it in Egypt and elsewhere, all the media began looking around the Arab world for political conflict. So it was assumed that this is an ethnic sort of behavior, that it wasn't response to injustice, it's Arab response to injustice. And so no look beyond that region for the echoes of this thing, and therefore not near enough of reporting of things like the folks in Egypt who called up the pizza parlor in Madison, Wisconsin, and sent orders of pizza to support the workers on strike here. These global dimensions of it, the universal side of this, needs to be emphasized more broadly, and we need to give them help. Thank you.
Abu Bakr?
This works. Our book should get from IIIT, the International Institute of Islamic Thought. I just want to first add my voice to all those who thank Jamil Aydin for a successful conference. And I just want to share two major insights. One of them belongs to what Professor Voll said about a holistic approach to understanding history. And the other one related to Richard Bulliet's insight of people history and looking south. Holistic approach, I was reading a couple of weeks ago Graham Fuller's book, A World Without Islam. Although the book itself was rather speculative, but he's trying just to make the argument that even if Islam did not exist, still we would have ended up with the Crusades, we would have ended up with a lot of the bad things that are now connected with Islam in understanding history. And he makes the historical argument, put up the facts that indeed the Crusades were not just Christian and Muslim, they were Christian, and the largest massacre was in Constantinople. And these are established historical facts, but they are not popular. When nowadays someone talks about the Crusades, you understand that it is Christian versus Muslim. That is not the case. So from that, a holistic approach would actually put Islam and the whole historical experience of it within the context of larger patterns of world history that would help us understand the current reality and where Islam and the Muslim fits within world affairs today. So that is one major insight. The other one is people's history and looking south. I'm from the south, and John Voll knows very well about Sudan and West Africa. Like nowadays, a lot of the tension that results from the cultural pressure of Muslim communities and their attempt to assert themselves in different ways, politically and economically, happen within these communities. You look at all the fury of the implementation of Sharia in Nigeria. We hear about it, it's reported as news. Little is done by way of study, analysis of how is that happening and why? Why are the Muslims of Nigeria now trying to assert themselves in terms of the implementation of Sharia? A good friend of mine, Ricardo Lament from the University of Binghamton, just published a book, and I helped him do it, on Sharia law, Islam and politics in northern Nigeria. But we need more of that type of work in understanding and looking south and understanding Islam in West Africa. The second example is the Tijaniya, the Sufi Tariqa, and the way they're expanding now worldwide, economically and politically, and in West Africa they are consolidating their influence, whereby their transnational influence on states is something that a lot of people in the West really don't appreciate because of the lack of sufficient writing on the contemporary Sufi movements in the South. So that is the last point is about the experience of Hajj and studying it culturally from the people's perspective. I think that is very important and understudied, and we would love to have more scholars study the experience of Hajj in West Africa from an anthropological perspective.
Okay, now let me just get a sense of who wants to say stuff for a minute so that I can see where we are. Okay, I will be gender inclusive for the moment. Nellie.
I think when we talk about Islam in the Western world, we can mean very many things. We can mean terrorism, we can mean religion, we can mean civilization. So personally, I think one way to get out of the impasse is to talk a little bit less about religion, because I feel that in the Western world, it is as if people were obsessed with Islam in our part of the world, which they're not. They live normal lives. They have to work. They have problems with their work. They have to save money. I think we need to emphasize that there are other important aspects in these people's lives, just like everybody else, and that they are not fully obsessed with religion as this description seems to indicate. So perhaps a little bit more of economic life and a little bit more about material life and a little bit more about the problems, the disputes, the confrontations they have to face would help to perhaps change the image.
In the back, yeah.
Harun Mughal, I guess representing the Mughal Empire. That was a joke. We're in an extended timeout, not a decline. So that was another joke. So I had a few questions and also a potential frame building off of Professor Bulliet's point. The first is Professor Voll said Americans need a better understanding of Islam, which provoked a few questions. Firstly, what do we mean by understanding? And I mean this in just the framing sense. Do we want Americans in general not to freak out when it comes to Islam, to respect, admire Islam? I mean, these are different. These have different implications. I think building off of the professor's point also on Islam, do we mean American Muslims? Do we mean Muslims generally? Do we mean the religion of Islam? Because these have implications in terms of foreign policy, domestic policy, such as with the King hearings right now. And to Professor Bulliet's point, to the people who voted with their faith, I kind of like that. I thought it was an interesting frame and something to think about going forward. Rather than focus on a defensive frame, Islam is not this, why not take to people who are peddling obvious falsehoods or stereotypes and force them into a defensive position, wherein if you say that hundreds of millions of people follow these traditions or made the choice to follow this tradition, to therefore say that tradition is irremediably evil is to offer an incredibly negative view of the human being. That across time and space, people have just bought into evil. And I think maybe just going forward, something to keep in mind, that might be an interesting angle to take. So I like the open civilization frame.
I'd want to just respond quickly to that because I have a personal experience of trying to answer this question, but in an interview for Mujtama, a relatively conservative magazine some years ago, and we were talking, and I used a wrong verbal noun. We were talking about what is the problem with American relations with the Muslim world, what is the chief thing that's the problem? And I thought I was saying, well, the real problem on the part of Americans, they don't know anything about Islam. The real problem is ignorance. But the verbal noun that I used was jahiliyyah. And so I got really good coverage. Jahiliyyah is the problem. But I think that as a teacher, and I think Jim Leach's starting point is not that Americans are inherently anti-otherness, which may be the case, but is not in this case, but rather that it is there is a woeful ignorance that before we can get critical thought on the part of the public, they need to know better information. And of course, it would be nice if we could educate our commentators too, rather than letting them talk. But at any rate then, Jerry.
Two quick points. First, Dick noticed that religion played a role kind of around the margins of our discussions here. Some more issues that entered the discussion only marginally are women and gender relations. This is obviously something that needs a lot more attention, especially if we're talking about trying to build new ways of understanding Islam and reframing the questions and the narratives. Second point is, yeah, I also, like Giancarlo and some others, appreciate the way of thinking about all of the issues under the rubric of the open society or the open, whatever you want to call it. I guess I would like to tweak that just a little bit because in the way that we have spoken about it so far, it's open in the sense that it's welcoming to people from all kinds of places well beyond the three empires, from Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa and so forth. Let's make place for Islam as a player, for Islamic societies and lands and peoples as interactive agents in the rest of the world. I think one of the reasons why this may have jumped out to Giancarlo is in his book, the Ottoman Empire is the protagonist, but they are collaborating with the Acehnese. Now this goes well beyond the interactions between Ottomans, Mughals, and Safavids that we have spoken about a little bit here, and brings a very different part of the Muslim world into the picture. Then we can go further, and it's not just Muslims beyond the three empires, but also the Europeans and the others that Nabil is talking about. So if we're talking about an open empire, let's make a way for it to be an interactive agent as well as a receptacle for those who wish to come in from otherwise not so prominent venues.
In talking about open society, then, are you suggesting a possible source for funding for our next conference? Terry.
Yeah, in the spirit of cantankerousness, I guess what I want to say is it's not about Islam, right? And it's very much about American empire and American fears of the decline of empire. Gibbon did not write in a vacuum. He wrote at a time when he thought the British Empire was collapsing, right? So that empires and their ends are often pitiable, and in their thrashings about, they often do stupid things. I hope that will not be the case here, and I think this group can play an important role, but we need to first diagnose what's going on and what role we might be able to play, and as citizens, maybe even more so than as academics, because I really don't think the problem is wrong information. I think the problem is people are on edge. We are in a depression. We have a declining empire. The renminbi is now being quoted widely on world stock markets. There is a new currency in town. And so the signs and portents of things to come are everywhere evident, and people begin looking for scapegoats. So if anti-Semitism could have been the socialism of fools in Europe, I fear that anti-Islamism may become the socialism of fools in the United States. And what we have to say by way of factual information is of no account. Right, so that's the first thing. And the second thing is that doesn't mean we can't try, and we can't use the tools that we've got, but we've got to use them wisely, and we've got to understand that we've got to do the marketing of our marketing survey of our public. We've got to decide which pieces of the public we're trying to reach, how. Right, so for some of them, it might be little 15-minute loops that you can access from an app, right? For others, it might be some sort of YouTube feature that might interestingly pose things. Rather than professors as talking heads, it might be cartoons, it could be a lot of different things, right? But we need to try and figure out what audiences we're addressing and how we want to go about doing that. And some certainly of what we want to get across has to do with new ways of thinking. And I think Dick's proposal of open society is a good start.
I said open civilization.
Open civilization, okay, fine. So, I mean, open society,
is actually somebody else's term.
right, that base has already been taken. So, all right, and I also want to say, as one of the world historians present, that world historians have spent a lot of trying to develop some terminology that will work around the world. And rather than reinvent the world, reinvent a terminology that already exists, it might be useful to check out what world historians have been doing and to just see if any of it is adaptable to our particular purposes. The word colonialism has not been mentioned, and obviously the word colonialism is central to the whole what went wrong question. The answer really is not no coal, that was a sort of a funny aside. The answer is colonialism. And that needs to be faced up to too. There's a history that we are ignoring, that we are, we as a public have been taught to ignore, and that's something that we need to face up to and to address. I could go on, but I'll stop.
Okay, great. Yeah.
Again, just to follow up on that, indeed there are different. We are in a meeting financed by President Obama appointed Director Lynch, that's America. But at the same time, there have been reference to all kinds of horrific reactions or incomprehensible reactions to Islamic symbols, etc. That's America too. On the other hand, I mean, we have been talking about openness, etc., dynamism of the empires, in these three empires, much of which is true, but at the same time, as Giancarlo said, they're over. And what you face now is not like the examples given by Hannah from the way women are treated in Cairo Sharia court. The examples are how they're treated in Pakistan. And I mean, there are, of course, very tolerant Muslims who are also very proud of their identity as Muslims. Yes, I am one of them. But at the same time, I mean, there are all these other problems which are associated with Islam, and they're also on the floor. So it's not easy. I mean, one one concept that we can work with, which is already, of course, here, we're talking about globalization, global modernity. But we have to remember that almost everywhere, including the United States, with globalization comes all these kinds of reactions that are not only, that are maybe aggrandized, aggravated by economic crisis, but they have already been there. There's American exceptions, some of which ties to Puritan sort of reactions in American culture that there is good and evil constantly fighting with each other, and we need an evil, and where is the evil? It was the red evil, now we have the green evil. I mean, there are all kinds of other cultural themes, but at the same time, indeed, I mean, we are I mean, the Muslims in this country lived and were accepted and could practice their religion more freely than they did, say, in France. That's also this country. So, I mean, indeed, who's your audience? And the timing is very important. There are also other kinds of political issues which are not mentioned. but they could be brought into the picture. But indeed, it is important to know who do you want to reach from among the public? And in that regard, I think also relevant to more sort of complicated issues, academic issues, philosophical issues involved in this, that would have some relevance, I mean, to whatever we do, including the classrooms in which we teach, try to reach our students. Indeed, this tension between globalization comes with localization. That's connected to broader issues that we see, and on and off came up in this conference from day one, meeting one. There's a tension between generalities and particularities in any kind of society. There's tension in law between universalistic claims that the law has to make, and at the same time particularities which law has to accommodate. I mean, having said this, I mean, we can play with these, I mean, we have to take these concepts into consideration, but I want to make, I mean, two sort of objections to what's said here. One of them, legacy of this, the decline since after 1258, 13th century, is not an invention of of Arab nationalism. It's an invention of late 19th century colonialism. And so again, I could specify that Arab nationalism comes into the picture at a later time, really early 20th century. We have to make clear that stems from Ernest Renan, who, despite all his contributions in other respects, has been responsible, has been chiefly responsible and most influential, one of the most influential representatives of this kind of, there's rational societies, and they give us modernity, what we are, all these academics. And then there are the Semitics, including the Jews, I mean, and also Arabs, etc., who have been sort of thinking about all these other sort of evasive ideas, and they are the irrational ones. And in a sense, they're hopeless unless they change their thing. But now, I mean, from here, I want to also make an objection to what Professor Bulliet has remarked. He made too much of a generalization about the history of enlightenment. Enlightenment, in the Enlightenment era, I mean, go on and on this, I won't. But there was an openness that is really remarkable, especially when you compare it to Europeans at the end of the century in the colonial era. We can explain this, I mean, historically and also in terms of certain concepts, but this is very clear. I should make my students read travel accounts from the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, and then I make them read travel accounts as sources. I mean, we have to deal with sources in history to give them that taste of working with sources. Can assign them on the things they can read, which is not Arabic or Ottoman or Persian, but and end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. They hardly ever fail to discover that there is a very significant sort of gap. One brings into the picture at the end of the century with whole baggage of already decided, determined judgments, as opposed to the earlier ones, which are curious, which are open, which are willing to see. This also reflects in something else. The earlier Europeans marry locally. They accept jobs locally. They have their families, these Indian officials. They take them to Europe proudly. I mean, they exhibit their colored wives and children. But at the end, it is forbidden for Indian officials in India to mix with the locals, which is enlightenment. We have to make a distinction between enlightenment and its positivistic, scientistic, colonialistic derivatives at the end of the 19th century. Unfortunately, all the social science disciplines, including history, formed at the end of the 19th century. We carry that baggage with us, and I wish we could go back to enlightenment and restructure this.
Now that sounds like a good stopping point, wish.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'd like to actually, the distinguished participants, to reflect more analytically on the vocabulary that we are using actually to talk about extremely diverse and discrete societies under the rubric of Islamic Muslims. I don't think anybody is comfortable with using them, in their scholarship and in our classrooms. We use it for Islam, art and architecture, all the way to politics and economy and society, individual societies, history, present, past. All of this under, basically three vocabulary items: Islamic, Muslim, and Islam. So, obviously, bringing out an alternative to this is not easy, as it is not easy to bring an alternative, for example, to the term Middle East. Suwana we tried, but it didn't really work. But at the same time, we are aware that, and we should be more actually engaging theoretically with the issue, is that, when we talk about social, economic, historical, political, aesthetic issues, individuals and societies under this terminology, we ourselves who hate essentialism, we actually fall into the trap of essentialism by bringing Puerto Rican Muslim with a Javanese Muslim. They don't have anything to share. Why then we are talking about them, as Muslims? So, there has to be some kind of solution to this one. Well, one of them probably would be talking about societies. We talk about Roman Empire, not Islamic Empire. We talk about Achaemenid Empire, not Muslim Empire. We talk about Ottoman history. We talk about British history. We talk about French history. Why then we are not trying to develop, a vocabulary range that could actually address specific topics? And following up on Professor Nelly Hanna's point, then we address actually specific questions in particular time and space limitations, rather than these broad categories that we call Islam and Muslims and all of that.
Thank you. In the back. Yeah, that's you. You're about as far back as we can get there.
Following on that, I was actually going to make the suggestion that instead of open civilization, it should be open civilizations. But I don't know if that's a minor point. But also following on the Enlightenment question, one of the things that I wanted to say is that, we talk a lot about the question of speaking to the public, and it's very important, I think. Although I share Professor Burke's reservation that, in many ways I'm fatalist about it as well. A lot of this information is already available and people simply don't want to listen. But beyond thinking about speaking to the public, we also have a challenge, as I sort of suggested yesterday, of convincing some of our colleagues who work on who do post-colonial scholarship or who work on, sort of modernity generally, and convincing them to take, the medieval and the early modern seriously at all. And I can give, a few examples. I mentioned philology and William Jones and that sort of thing yesterday, and how you can trace a genealogy from Jones's understanding of Indo-Persian comparative philology right up through Chomsky and so forth. And that, sort of prehistory of modern linguistics has been scrubbed. But you can give all kinds of other examples on tolerance, for instance. And, I speak of Mughal stuff because that's what I work on. But, on tolerance, for instance, recent scholarship makes very plausible and convincing case that, the discourse on tolerance that is emerging in 17th century England, leading up to Locke's, famous essay, comes from, begins with travelers who have come to Mughal India, Safavid Iran, and other places, who come back to England and hang out in the pubs and the emerging public sphere, and they say to their patrons and their friends, basically, listen, what we're doing over here, all this religious killing, is crazy because intolerance is bad for business. And the examples that they give are from other places. Look at the Mughals, look how wealthy they are. It's because they're tolerant. Look at the Safavids. I'm not sure, but so you can show these things, and scholarship has shown it. In metaphysics and philosophy, you can show very easily that Dara Shiko's translation of Sirr Akbar, the Upanishads, in the middle of the 17th century, is taken up by Anctil du Perron in the late 18th century, translated into Latin, which is how William Jones sees it, and that's how it gets disseminated into Europe. To the point, and it was read so much, to the point where Schopenhauer named his dog Atma because he was such a big fan of this translation of the Upanishads. And, you know, it's a goofy example, right? But from Schopenhauer, you get to Nietzsche, you get to Derrida, and I mean, you know, and reintegrating those kind of intellectual genealogies, not for the public even, but for our own colleagues who tend to, you know, reinscribe and reinforce this kind of sharp demarcation between the colonial moment or the Western modern moment and everything that came before, as if everything that came before is irrelevant, is, I think, a challenge for us to actually convince them. And I'll give one last example, you know, or two quick ones. One, you know, I recently heard a talk by, you know, a friend and a senior colleague who basically tried to make the argument that the category, the disciplinary category research, that is a scholarly research in terms of sifting through sources and evaluating which source is more reliable and so on and so forth, for the purposes of historical inquiry, that category was a product of colonial modernity, and that Jadunath Sarkar, the famous Mughal historian of 19th and 20th century India, is basically the person who brings this discourse of research into Indian historical writing. And I pointed out that, well, you know, I mean, there's plenty of disciplinarity in pre-modern scholarship. The term tahqiq, Himmat was talking about yesterday, the term tahqiq and how it was understood in jurisprudence and other kinds of scholarly inquiry, or in lexicography and philology, or in historical inquiry. I mean, you can demonstrate repeatedly that chronicles, historical chronicles, for instance, some of the ones that I look at, you know, the writers will say, so-and-so said this in his chronicle, but I have done the research, the tahqiq, and shows that he's wrong about that, and it's this, and you can show these things. But many of my dear post-colonial friends, post-colonial colleagues, will turn around and there's a kind of gesture of dismissing those kind of examples. When you give counterexamples or you try to point these things out, there's often a gesture of saying, that doesn't count-ism. Mm-hmm. And you know, one will often get different kind of responses. So for instance, well, that doesn't count because it wasn't a colonial apparatus imposing it. And you say, well, I don't know about that. Or they say, well, it doesn't count because there wasn't capitalism. And they say, oh, it doesn't count. There's all kinds of excuses for why these things don't count. So I have other examples. I don't want to go on and on. But the larger point is that, you know, we have to speak to the public, but we also have to convince not just our post-colonial scholar colleagues, but those who work on Europe and the Renaissance, and so to actually take some of this seriously as part of the unfolding of modern history, as Professor Bulliet pointed out. I mean, I also noticed the subtitle, and you know, I think that part of the story is important. That there's a wider participation in the creation of what we call modernity, that simply is scrubbed from the record. Anyway.
Great. Now, Jamil, did you want to say something? Yes. Should I let you say something?
Yes, thank you. I wanted to apologize for not clarifying some things, but of course we did assume that colonialism is a turning point. So there is some sort of a subtext that we assume that everybody agrees that it is the turning, it is what went wrong. But however, I think going back to Jim Leach and why is a public foundation is supporting such a project of understanding is sad for us in the sense that in this age, in 21st century, there is so much of new type of racism about Muslim societies. And as you said, we have to do marketing. We probably could not reach Glenn Beck. That's impossible with the caliphate socialist theory. That group, because they have a different agenda, but we have to give tools and concepts and ideas to a large group of people who are disturbed by it, but they get the arguments and they are looking for ways to respond to it. And in that regard, I think what Engin Bey mentioned is this racialization of Muslims, and Hayrettin was talking about that too. There's this idea of the Muslim world, which is my next book. and as a sort of racial category in the late 19th century emerges with Renan and others. And somehow retrospectively now, I wish that Muslims were all pink or purple, so that they were racialized with their skin color, otherwise in the age of colonialism, but they were neither black nor yellow, so they were otherized as a distinct inferior group as the Muslims. And then responses also have to use that category, but that category had a lot of historical information. You know, what is wrong with them? Their religion, dogmatic. Their history, always fighting with the West. And then it's very complex, obviously, that Muslim modernists have to use the same category. So that idea emerged. But then when we passed through decolonization and Holocaust and World War II and established UNESCO and everything, we did very well with racism in terms of overcoming it. But we forgot that the idea of the Muslim world was Islam West, was a corollary, a parallel to racism, and it's completely forgotten. The categories kind of was there, that Muslims are always traditional and West is modern or rational. And I think something happened, you know, it's a different trajectory after the Cold War, when we have this new reaction, that all of these tools are being utilized by groups who are demonizing or dehumanizing the Muslims. And I think that's why I feel vindicated with that group's discussion about history, because now we have a different narratives of history that is against the late 19th century invented history of whatever it is, from Max Weber to Ernest Renan, that can hopefully be turned into a conceptual toolbox that can be utilized for good-intentioned people who are trying to respond to recent crises within America, but also in international affairs. And I will leave it here. Thank you.
Yeah, in the beard and then clean shaven.
Okay, thank you. I have different and shorter observations. First of all, I would like to say again that probably the most who benefited among all of you is myself, because I've learned a lot from your scholarship. And I'll just build on what Dr. Voll and Bulliet said. First, you said you need a bridge between the scholars and the public. I think also you need another bridge between the scholars and the practitioners like us. So the connection between the historians, the professors who deal with students in their classrooms have to connect with community members like myself, organizations who can translate your knowledge into practical programs. And I hope that tomorrow and the day after tomorrow we will witness some of these ideas. The second thing is the language. The way Lewis succeeded in only the title of his book, What Went Wrong, you're right. They don't have to read anything else. They just read the cover. And I think what's missing today is translating this history, whether decline or golden age, which I believe, even if it was decline, it was not declining all of a sudden. There was contribution during that period, even of decline. And that has been missing. And what we need today is the packaging of the message and qualifying the messenger. And I think this is what's missing in the public discourse today. So Glenn Beck, he has put in his head some of these wrong ideas, but he has the ability to deliver. And recently, honestly, I have to admit this, I was pleasantly surprised that even Fuad Ajami, who's seen as a historian, shifted because of the Tahrir Square evolution. He's been hosted on CNN, if you've seen him several times, and he has shown the ability to interpret current events, from a historical background. So now the public see a valuable individual like him. I personally disagreed with a lot of his views, even about Arabs and Muslims in the Middle East, but these days I have been impressed by his ability to positively interpret events in the Middle East, especially in Tunisia and in Egypt, and I think that's a major shift I myself would like to acknowledge. So the challenge to many of you will be, and this is my honest advice, is, including myself, we need training to, as I said earlier, to reduce so much history into sound bites. into short answers. Of course, you're used to giving lectures, and even your comments are no less than 5 to 6 minutes. So my advice to you is, if you can speak in shorter sentences with a lot of meat in them, so that people like us can digest. So that is an honest advice, because I would like to see the public benefiting from your knowledge and your contribution and your writings. And finally, then I'll stop with one final note. To help alleviate the fear, the legitimate fear because of ignorance about Islam and Islamic civilization, they do not want to see us as the other. They don't want to see us versus them. So instead of sometimes talking about Islam in the West as like an intruder, why don't we talk about the West in Islam, which means the values that people practice today in terms of freedom, democracy, respect for one another, appreciation of energy, of intellectualism, rationalism, and reason and logic, which are part of Islam. Why don't we tell the West that these are also Islamic values? And that's really shared culture that people do not see. And that's exactly, it fits in your announced initiative, or by Jim Leach, the bridging culture. They have to see that we have a lot of shared values that they cherish, and the Muslim world does cherish as well. Thank you.
I actually am going to follow up right on that. That's kind of what I was thinking. What would be the 5-second thing? What would be the 3 words? And I, like Giancarlo, second your suggestion of openness. And then other 2 words that I could think of would be diverse and mobile. So the word diversity, mobility, openness. It may be... Wirelessness. Sorry? Wirelessness. Mobility, when I was thinking, about this, the legacy of Muslim societies in global modernity, what could be that Muslim societies did that was part of this period? Mobility was the word that came to me. Both, as you showed, they are moving all around, global, the Ottoman age of exploration. And then what I was always thinking about, how there is mobility, upward mobility. So mobility is also a value that people in the United States would very much appreciate and relate to. So mobility could be one concept to work on. Diversity is something the United States very much appreciates, and I think it is there when we think about what you said about conversions in that era and how this whole Southeast Asia became Muslim, Africa, and all that increased the diversity of Islam in this period, and then openness. So these 3 could be the basic concepts to build on. And then when I think about sort of like, if we had an ad on TV, what would we put on there? There's different kind of people who make the Islamic world. It could be perhaps stories, because that's something that Professor Hanna's point had a lot of resonance, because stories always help people relate to. So stories that are built around diversity, mobility, openness, I think could be a public message we could carry.
Good. Let me just see, we are closing in on 6 o'clock. Who am I looking at? I've got you and Patrick and in the back, okay?
And over here.
So we have 4, and we don't have 5 minutes for each, but let's be gender equal in the back. Okay. 1, 2, 3 with Patrick, 4.
He's saying also.
Yeah, that's...
My comment is very brief, apart from thanking everyone for making it easy to do this. And I want to recognize also my colleagues Anne Birkelbach and Golnessa and Izzet Shahada and Wilaya and Zuhair Shah also, in addition to the leadership of Jamal Aydin, which has been remarkable. But what I want to say is what I've been throwing out logistics all this time. especially as I've been throwing out all the time and saying, go to the website, go to the website. Because what we had to do in this brief period of 2 days is to make concentrated orange juice, or like a concentrated tomato paste. How do you fit all those 8 great tomatoes in that little bitty can, is what we had to do. So the practitioners need to go and pull out the stories that are in all the wonderful new and older works of these scholars who are here. That's where we can find them. It's not going to be served to us on a silver platter. We're going to have to go in and pull those stories out that they had to excise in order to get across their main ideas here today. And thank you so much. I have also benefited tons.
Great, thank you. Okay, yeah.
Right here, quickly. Okay. I mean, I think, you know, often in a final session, it's a sort of a summation session, so we tend to essentialize about things because we're trying to summarize 2 days' worth of things. And what I want to say is that I think by positing this idea of the Islamic world, we're kind of dealing with a universal that's inherently problematic because we know the particulars are very different. And I mean, what I would suggest is that that universal notion of an Islamic world is sort of the problem, because, you know, we've had this debate as to whether, you know, Islam is a religion of peace or it's a religion of war. And these are theological sorts of issues that, you know, will never be sorted out. And so I think what's important is we get back to rough ground. And there, I think nationalism is something that hasn't been mentioned at the conference. And in the construction of nationalism, particularly for Islamist actors and others. So nationalism and its own construction of rise and fall, right? I mean, if you think about the debates about whether Farabi, you know, was a Turk or a Persian, I mean, all of these things have to do with a particular ethnicity trying to anchor itself in a particular rise, right? And so I just think that nationalism as a kind of concept that obviously comes out of the French Revolution and 1798, Napoleon and all of that, is a lens, and also the notion of ideology as coming out of the French Revolution. These are sort of two lenses, I think, with which we can analyze the question of rise and fall.
Thank you.
This is something actually like an encouragement so that you don't feel alone in your struggle. There is a project of translation led by scholars and colleagues at NYU in Dubai. They have gotten a grant last year for, you know, about $5 million, and it is going to be repeated again with another $5 million down the road to translate the masterpieces of Arabic literature into English, specifically targeting actually public audience and classroom. So that, you know, they are calculating about 2,000 books to be translated into English. Yeah.
Thank you. And Patrick?
Classic, modern, you know, philosophy, history, heritage.
Patrick?
Iqbal made a strong and, to me, totally convincing statement about what a particular moment we are in the public discourse about the Middle East, the Islamic world. The Atlantic literature on slavery has been active for some 40 years now. It was remarkable when it got started in the midst of decolonization and civil rights that it made a start, but surprisingly it kept going and going. And the reason why it kept going is because the concern with freedom and the concern with slavery are tied together. As you know, the side effects have been wonderful development of knowledge at social science level, and really a significant easing of the social problems. This is a time for analysis of the question of slavery in the Islamic world. It will be productive.
Thank you. And before I give it to you, I just want to say, I want to be a pure academic. Care will forgive me and so on. But one of the values of a conference like this as well is that we learn something. And maybe, you know, maybe it's because I teach at Georgetown in the School of Foreign Service where everybody is always high-geared of, you know, what's this going to do for my resume and so on. And I think it's important that we all be aware of the relevance of our detailed particular studies to contemporary affairs, and we've got to pay attention to Tahrir, we've got to pay attention to that whole host of challenges that are out there. But I do think part of the problem with dealing with the audiences that we want to persuade is that a lot of times we are so serious about what we're doing. This is why I like, the humor in Islamic history that people kept trying to mention, but I didn't get very many good jokes. But that we are all so serious about the current events relevance of what we're studying. I'm old enough, there aren't very many of you that are as old as I am, but I can remember when all you could teach, at least for a couple of years during Vietnam War, was something that it had to be relevant. And if it wasn't relevant, nobody would sign up for your classes. But I think part of the thing with the kind of information that we're looking at is that it's also going to be important for us to make it enjoyable to learn about the Safavids, make it enjoyable to learn about the Mughals, make it enjoyable to learn about the Ottomans. I mean, if we can't make it exciting and fun as teachers for the general public, they're not going to be persuaded if we just sit and scowl at them and say, you have to know this because this wasn't a decline. And I think that we've, and I think that we've gotten a really important sort of pieces of information. We've gotten a really important impetus, and we've got lots of stuff that's relevant. But also, I think we all enjoy what we're doing. At least I hope so.